Hello and welcome. This is a pre-recorded video of a webinar that I offered live on February 18 with the topic of forming collaborative relationships with statisticians. This is really for anybody who may need to work with a statistician or a data scientist and is kind of wondering what that looks like and how that might work. So in this webinar, I present you with some very general information to help you prepare for that meeting and help you understand what to expect. I also talk about a general framework for collaboration that can really help ensure that you get the best answers to the questions that you are asking, whether it's for research or business or policy making or whatever that question is that you might be needing help with. I have cut some of the housekeeping for people who were actually attending the webinar live at the very beginning. But the idea is that this is the first in a series of webinars designed to help people work better with statisticians and have more confidence in their approach to those kinds of collaborations. So if that sounds like you and you would like to sign up for more information about my webinars, there is a link in the video description below. And here we go. I think most of you probably know me since I kind of extended the invitation to people I've worked with in the past or people that I know who might be interested in it. But you can always go to my webpage to learn more about me. I am a private statistical collaborator, and with a lot of experience in academia before I went private. The best way to contact me is by email, and that is krlove, like my name, and QCC, like quantitative consulting and collaboration, because I picked the longest name I possibly could for my business. But yeah, krloveqcc.com. Just to give you a little more perspective, if you're not as familiar with me, I think my real joy in statistical collaboration is working with people who don't feel super confident about statistics. I don't know that every statistical collaborator feels that same way. Some are very specialized and prefer to work with people who already have a very strong background and maybe need some technical help with something very specific. But I really do enjoy working with people who are maybe not starting out feeling the most confident about statistical analyses. So that also is probably going to come out in the way I talk about statistics. So here's today's topics. I am going to start by talking about general statistical collaborators and who are they, but really I mean who are we? Who am I and people like me? And what can you expect when you're reaching out to a statistical collaborator? So there will be some people here who have not worked with a statistical collaborator before, or if you are one, you may not have had this perspective on statistical collaborators before. So I think it's important to share just what can you expect? Like, who are we and what can you expect when you go to work with a statistical collaborator? Oh, and I say collaborator. A lot of people use the term statistical consultant. I don't shy away from the term consulting, but my whole emphasis is sort of on the collaboration piece, so I tend to use that word more often when I say a statistical collaborator. So we'll talk about who they are and what you can expect. Then I'm really going to get into the meat of the presentation, which is based on a paper that two colleagues of mine wrote, which is the ASKR framework. And this is basically a framework that you can kind of use in all parts of the collaborative process, kind of covers lots of different areas of that. And ASKR is an acronym, and we're going to go through each part of the acronym individually, and it refers to attitude, structure, content, communication, and relationship. And I'll get into all of this more and how it relates to statistical collaboration as we go, and then I will provide my final thoughts. So let's get into it. Let's talk about statistical collaborators and who they are. And I think the number one thing I would say about this is that we are people. We are people. We are all going to be different. I know I have a lot of veterinary folks. I have a lot of nurses and people involved in other areas of health. So I can really compare this to, going to the doctor or taking your animal to go see a vet. They're all going to be different. And yes, they are all qualified. They all have some background that makes it appropriate for them to be in that position. But they are going to have their own views. They're going to have their own education, their own background. They're all going to have a different way of working with their clients. If you've ever seen two doctors, you know that doctors can vary a lot in terms of how they approach things. And they can all be valid doctors. They're just different. And you will find the same thing, of course, with statistical collaborators. And you may even find more differences among statistical collaborators than you might in some of these other areas. We're all going to have different preparation, different experience, different preferences. Um, and, I'll talk about this a little bit more, but with respect to our different background and different preparation for collaboration, this is not going to be like training you might get in a medical related field. Um, there is no requirement for something like a residency. There is no requirement that, you can get a PhD at some places without ever having worked with a real project or a real person with a real question. It is becoming more and more common to try to integrate that into these curriculums. Um, now there are sometimes requirements for internships or, at least a solid push to have an internship and some real world experience. A lot of universities now will have a sort of a consulting center or a place you can go, and sometimes students really get hands-on experience there. Sometimes it's less hands-on. There are classes in statistical collaboration, but none of these are going to, I will say none of these are universal. So the training that we are expected to have or are exposed to in school can vary a whole lot. And I will say there are some universities that theory is going to be the real push. And there's just not that much excitement for collaboration. So the preparation that people will naturally get if they don't pursue it can be very different from one person to another. The paper that I'm talking about today is actually that's kind of the gap that it is trying to address. So there are those of us out there who are really advocating strongly for this, but it is not something that is universal at this point by any means. We'll also have differences with respect to our statistical knowledge. We all have knowledge that we learn in, if we have a master's or a PhD, we'll all have familiarity with some basic types of analyses, but I also want to emphasize that there are some types of analyses that are really particular to certain subject matter areas. It is not unheard of that I will meet with somebody and they'll say, "Hey, we were thinking about doing this analysis," and they'll tell me the name of an analysis, and I will not have heard of it. And it's not because I don't have statistical background or knowledge. It's because it's so specific to something that you are working on. Um, that it may just be something I've never had any reason to be exposed to before. So depending on who you're working with, how closely tied they are to your area of expertise, they may or may not know those very specific things. And then finally, of course, subject matter knowledge kind of ties into the same thing, except this has more to do with, what knowledge does someone have about veterinary work or about occupational therapy or language or whatever the topic is that you're looking at. I am really very much a generalist. I love learning about new topics. I love getting into new subject matter. But there is, of course, when I get started, that barrier and that I may not know very much about it during that first, couple of projects. Doesn't necessarily mean you can't work with that person, but there will be a little bit more of a hurdle to get over when you first start working together. So I just want to acknowledge that as well. I also want to say two different statisticians may give you two different recommendations for how to approach something. That's just like if I go to two different doctors, they might recommend two different treatments. Two different occupational therapists might be working with totally different technology, two different sets of tools, and they might approach things a different way. But ultimately, they will get you where you need to go. And I would say the same thing with statisticians. If you get two different recommendations, they're both probably okay. And of course, you should use some discretion, but the goal is to make sure you're answering your research question or your business question, whatever it is, And there may be different ways to approach that that are equally valid. So something else to be aware of. I do want to also talk about what statistical collaborators can do. And everybody may have their different areas that they prefer to work in, or different things that they feel they have more expertise in. But I think people are sometimes surprised by the range of things that we can help with along the way. So I think most people are aware that, we can perform or refine or review your analyses. I think the analysis part is something everyone's aware of. But we can also, at the very beginning of your project, if you have a research question and you're not really sure how to approach it with your data, we can help you quantify your research questions. We can learn about what you're trying to do and what you're trying to ask, and help you turn that into a data question. We can help you refine your surveys and your instruments that you'll be using for quantitative analyses. We can help you design your sampling schemes to make sure that you're collecting your data in the most appropriate way possible. We can help you draft your analysis plan if you're applying for a grant and you need help with that. Or if you're still trying to decide what to do with your data. Of course, we can help you manage or revise your data. We can aid in interpretation. We can also help you with reporting your results. We can help with providing or suggesting visuals, which sometimes we forget that visuals can be really helpful, but they're usually one of the best ways to communicate with an audience that hasn't been as involved in the research as you. And I also want to mention that not all statisticians, but many statisticians welcome authorship level contributions. I'm no longer in academia. It's not going to help me get a promotion or anything like that, but I look at authorship as a way to be responsible for my contributions to a project. And so I do welcome the opportunity to work directly on a manuscript. I appreciate that. And I think sometimes people may not realize that when they first start working with a statistical collaborator. So feel free to involve us on that level. Now, given all of this, though, given that statisticians can be so different and we don't necessarily have any kind of unified system for learning how to be good collaborators, that all may have different areas and different specialties, how do you approach collaboration? So, how do you get started with this? How do you make sure that there's good communication? Yeah, it can be a little tricky. And so that's really the goal of the main thing I want to talk about today. Um, and this comes from a paper, an article that I mentioned was written by a couple of colleagues of mine, um, the ASCR framework. So it is an acronym, as we've already discussed. There's a link here to the paper, and there's also, you can scan the QR code if that's the easiest thing for you, but there is a link here to the paper. And so really briefly, the purpose of this paper, this is designed to create a framework for collaborative statisticians and data scientists. So this is really aimed at my people, and helping us to become better collaborators and kind of fill in that gap about what we may or may not have learned about collaboration. But as I was talking to some of my colleagues and I said, hey, I want to put together this series of webinars to help people become more confident when working with statisticians, to help them understand better what to expect. We were talking about how to go about this. This is a general framework. This paper is written for the specific situation of a statistician working with a subject matter expert or a domain expert, but it can easily be turned around. Like, all of the concepts in it can apply to either side of that table. And what we ultimately decided is it really doesn't matter who's bringing the collaborative attitude and the collaborative pieces to that interaction. Yes, it is often the statistician who is going to be responsible for leading that meeting, but the domain expert can always bring these pieces to the table and sort of lead by example. And so I'm going to rephrase that paper a little bit today to talk about the different aspects of collaboration and things that can be helpful. And I'd say the main context is collaborative skills are teachable and trainable. And as I said earlier, they're not really taught in classrooms very universally to statisticians. But as part of that is that there's kind of an attitude that, oh, you either can do collaboration or you're not. Like, you're good at it or you're not, and it's just natural and there's nothing to be done about it. And that's really not true. There are guidelines, there are skills that can be taught and can be trained and that we can kind of turn to help make our collaborations better. And so that is really the purpose of this paper is to say, here's how to make that work. And so there are 5 components of the Asker framework. And as I said, it's an acronym. And so here's their diagram that they use to kind of describe with some sort of visual reminders of what these different pieces are. But here's what the Asker stands for. It's attitude, structure, content, communication, and relationship. And all of these pieces work together. And I'm really going to talk about them kind of one at a time for the rest of this webinar. So let's start by talking about attitude. Attitude refers to the attitude of collaboration. And so what is collaboration? And let's define what we mean by collaboration. And this is why I prefer the word collaboration to consulting a little bit, is because I think it makes it more clear what the purpose is. Collaboration is working cooperatively to create solutions to research, business, and policy challenges and achieve research, business, and policy goals. And this is really just to emphasize that the relationship between a data person and a domain expert is not really just about answering a statistics question. It is about answering a bigger question, a research question or a business question or a policy challenge. And the best way to accomplish this is to come into this with a collaborative attitude. The whole project is really what we're sharing. It's going to be a lot more effective than just answering or sharing a data question. And so that's the attitude part. And we'll get a better understanding of what that means through the remaining pieces of this framework. So the next piece is structure. And this refers specifically to meeting structure. Meetings are still the primary mode of interaction for a statistician and a domain expert. And we can always exchange emails, but that's not going to have, I think that at least every client that I work with, from my perspective, my clients, I will want to have at least one meeting. Phone is okay. Zoom is better, and then some Zoom or any other meeting platform. And in person can sometimes be even better than that, depending on people's comfort levels and background with that. So meetings are still extremely important. And the meeting structure kind of functions like a checklist. So again, I know I have a lot of people in health-related areas here in my audience, and there's a lot of evidence-based practice around checklists. I mean, this has been shown to be effective. Checklists make sure that things happen, and so that's kind of the goal of having this meeting structure, is to make sure that everything that needs to happen during that meeting, during that interaction, happens. And there are lots of different structures out there that you can use for meetings. You can look this up on your own. It doesn't have to be this one. But the one that I have used for a long time is called the power structure, or the power process for meetings. And so again, we love acronyms. So this one's another acronym. And the parts of this are prepare, open, work, end, and reflect. So these are kind of the 5 big pieces that go along with any meeting. And this is something, again, that both the domain expert, so you, and the statistician can do and contribute to this meeting structure. And so the first part is preparing. And again, some of this is going to sound obvious, but it's something that we ignore a lot of times in practice. So again, the checklist just sort of makes sure that it happens. And so how do we prepare for a meeting? Well, there's 3 components to this. There's preparing mentally for a meeting. You review your agenda. If you have previous notes or if any material was sent for the meeting, review those things just to kind of get in the headspace for the meeting. Physically prepare for a meeting, so arrive early enough to prepare your environment. This is, oftentimes we're not meeting in person. I'm already sitting at my desk, but I have to show up for this meeting in time to make sure that I have my notes document open. I have the material that I've received open. I have anything that might be useful for me during the meeting on my computer, and I'm there early enough to start the Zoom meeting or whatever platform we're using. I have to be there early enough to dial the number or log in. And then finally, there's also the emotional preparation. I know we're a lot of people feel like this is a lot to talk about emotionally preparing, but honestly, it is important. At least for me, I often am in the middle of other work or other projects, and I need to make sure I reach a good stopping point for those unrelated tasks, things that are not part of the meeting. Otherwise, my focus may still be on those things during the meeting. So this is a really important part of any meeting or interaction that we a lot of times just ignore in practice or forget to do, even though I think we all would acknowledge this is a good idea. Then there's opening the meeting itself. So once you're on your meeting platform, you're on the phone or whatever you're doing for your meeting, of course you want to take some time to say hello, to greet each other, introduce yourselves if you haven't met before. And an important piece of the meeting is checking on time and making sure that you agree on and you understand how much time each person has available. Often we will have a set meeting time before we start, but sometimes people can't stay for the whole time. Sometimes people are more flexible and can stay a little bit later if they need to. And this is a good thing to check on in the beginning, not in the end. And also, there are some conversations that you have as part of opening a meeting. And so you can read more detail about each of these types of conversations if you want to, but the idea is to check in, find out what you want to get out of the meeting. There may be, as a domain expert, some specific questions that you have. You know, you want to just give an overview of your project. You want to introduce what it is that you're hoping the data scientist or statistician can help you with. And those will all become part of the agenda of the meeting. Um, we'll talk about I'm going to skip over the willing conversation a little bit, but the able conversation focuses on, okay, we have these things we want to accomplish in this meeting. Are these things that we are able to accomplish during this meeting? Do we have the time for it? Do we need to budget more time for this at another point? As a statistician, do I feel like I'm going to be able to help you with all the parts of this project? So those are all conversations that you want to have at the beginning to make sure you have an agenda. This part often the reason, that people will give, if you'll say, well, why didn't you create an agenda at the beginning of the meeting? Why didn't you set this up? People sometimes feel like they don't have the time for this piece. I think that's the most common reason for skipping this. But really, this is the piece that ensures that you do have the time to get to what you need to in the meeting. This is something that either side can bring to the meeting is this type of organization and just making sure that this is taken care of before you jump in and start doing what we would call the work of the meeting. I'm not going to talk very much about the work part because well, it's where you accomplish the things in the agenda, and that can be very specific to what the requests were. But I also think the remaining parts of the process will talk about appropriate ways to go about the work part, where you're doing most of the communication about your data, about your project, and about the statistical pieces. Um, and then I'm going to go ahead and get to the end part of the meeting. And the biggest thing for the end is really just allowing time for it and not saying, oh no, I have to go. Okay, we'll catch up later. That is the worst way to end a meeting. So make sure you allow time. I think the recommendation that is given is really for a half-hour meeting, allow 5 minutes to kind of wrap everything up. For an hour meeting, it may be 10 minutes, but it's going to be a little particular to the meeting. And this is where you're going to summarize your major decisions. You're going to clarify the next steps and deadlines on both sides. And you'll prepare a meeting summary. And it's usually best if that meeting summary is written and shared immediately after the meeting. Whether that's you, whether that's the statistician doing this, whether it's both of you, having written next steps that you can both refer to later on your own is essential. And then finally, there's the reflection piece. And so this is something you probably do individually after the meeting, but it could be something that you choose to do together or discuss. It's really up to you. But then, in order to make sure that your next meeting, your next interaction goes well, take a little bit of time to think about what went well during that meeting, what you accomplished that you wanted to accomplish, what maybe, also what did you not accomplish? What did not go so well about that meeting? And what might you do differently for a next meeting? So that's one version of a structure for a meeting. Again, from my perspective, of course, I'm always trying to teach statisticians and data scientists about this kind of structure. But if anyone brings these concepts to the meeting and tries to make sure that each of these pieces get done, it's going to promote that collaborative mindset and help you actually answer the questions that you're trying to answer. All right, so that was the A and the S in Asker. We're going to go on to the first C, which is content. All right, and so what do we mean by content? Well, there are three components really to every statistics and data science project that you should be incorporating to really get the best and most effective results from that interaction to come up with good answers to your research questions. And you can think about this as kind of an overarching thing for the entire project. You can think about this as part of the work part of each meeting that you have. But it's these three cues. We have a qualitative section, we have a quantitative section in the middle, and then we have a third qualitative section at the end. So we could call this QQQ. Sometimes we write Q1, Q2, Q3, but each of these is going to be a really important part of this collaboration. And so we start with the first qualitative part. And this is really going to be driven by you as the subject matter expert, the person who is bringing the problem, the research question, whatever it is you're working on to the table. And some things that I think for me personally as a statistician that are really going to give me the background that I need to answer your question appropriately with stats and with data is these things. What are you really trying to accomplish or answer? So one of my later webinars will get into coming up with good research questions and good hypotheses to really get this started. But what are you trying to answer? What is your question? Second part is why is it important? So let me give a couple of examples here. From my veterinary experience, let's say, what are you trying to accomplish or answer? Well, maybe your main question is you have a new method of nerve blocking a steer if you want to perform an operation on that steer, and you need to know if it's going to be effective. And so why is it important? Well, maybe it's important because you have other methods of nerve blocking, but they're not effective. And I need to understand what effective means. Maybe they're not easy to do. Maybe they don't work very well. So maybe you're blocking some areas so the steer can't feel anything during the surgery, but maybe not others. Maybe it doesn't last long enough. Maybe you have a method that's going to last longer. So why is it important? Like, what's the overall big picture about why you're asking this question? And what are the implications in practice? How will this help improve the surgery that you're doing? How will this help improve the experience for the animal or for the veterinarian? So what's the big picture of what's important about what you're doing? How will this work be used? So say that we find that this, nerve blocking method is appropriate and better than what's out there. What are we going to do with that then? How will that be implemented or used by people in your field? Next question, of course, is what data could solve the problem? And so maybe that's something we talk about together, but this is where we need to understand. So why would this method be better? Again, is it because it's easier to use? Is it because it is better at blocking what you need to block? Is it because it lasts longer? So knowing those things helps us decide, okay, what data do we need to collect in order to really determine whether that's the case? What data have been collected? What do you already have, if you have anything? And I'm always happy to meet with people before they have any data. That's a great time to meet with people. But if you have data that's been collected or that inspired the project, of course, I'd love to know about that. And then what other qualitative relationships might exist in your data? What is going to influence the answer to this question? Is it important how old these animals are? Is it important what kind of health condition they're in? All of these other things that can be related to the answer to your question, or what other things might exist that I wouldn't know about because I'm not a veterinarian, and I don't have that background yet. So what are the considerations from your perspective? The second part is the quantitative part, right? So we got the three Qs. This is the second one, which is the quantitative piece, kind of the middle of your sandwich, your QQQ sandwich. And this part I think has to be more driven maybe by the data person, your statistician, your data scientist. And this is where the technical skills of that person come into it. The idea here, though, in general, a lot of the steps that we take are just to explore your data, see what we have or see what data you should have or what might be available to you, visualizing and modeling. Again, we often leave out the visualization part, but it can be super important. So, I would say from your point of view, ask your statistician to create some visualizations for you. Again, we know it's important, but we're often so focused on numbers and analyses, we don't always remember about the picture part of it that makes it so much easier to communicate. And of course, this part is maybe the core of the interaction in the sense that this is why you're here and this is why we're meeting is to get this quantitative part done. But it's not going to be very effective. It's going to really be incomplete without the other two qualitative pieces. And so the final qualitative part that we should be thinking about is answering your real world question. So what did you come in with? What was the question you were trying to answer? Like if it was about that nerve blocking, okay, is it better and why? And how would we turn our numbers into an answer to that question? How is this? And I'm sorry, these are all AI generated pictures. It was all that was available now for some reason. But yeah, how is it going to help you in your actual veterinary practice? How is this going to improve the experience for animals? How is this going to be used in the emergency room? Is this something that can actually help there? Is it something that can really be implemented? Is this something that is going to help students learn in the classroom? And how do we turn our quantitative answer from the second part into this qualitative answer that can be used by practitioners and real world people? I do very few projects that are purely academic exercises. So we always have to make sure we have this part. And this is really, I think, a joint effort between the statistician and you, the content expert, right? This is going to require both of you to contribute and make sure that you've understood along the way everything that's happening. And so this is where we display and communicate those results for a more general audience. And all of those pieces really have to take place to make sure that this is a successful collaborative effort. So that was the contents. We've covered attitude, structure, which really refers to meeting structures, and content, which can be the whole project or within a given meeting, whatever it is that you're working on. We're going on to the second C then, which is communication. And I have to emphasize that communication is really about understanding. Understanding is not really what you said. It's not even what the other person heard, but it's really about what they understand and internalize. And it's really difficult to guess whether someone understood. People have kind of been conditioned to act like they understood something, even if they didn't. Or maybe they think they understood something and they didn't. So the only way to really know whether you have communicated and what has been understood is to do some kinds of check-ins. And so that's what this is about. I have had this moment here. This graphic made me laugh when I saw it because I feel like I've had this moment so many times as a statistician. My postdoc and where I worked for 3 years was in forestry, and I felt like I had so many light bulb moments where I was like, "Oh, this analysis is going to answer your question. It's going to be perfect, and we're going to learn this, this, and this." And then I look up, and they're kind of like that person on the right side of the picture, where you can tell they just did not understand anything I said, and they're kind of waiting for me to explain it in like real person language. And I think at first this was really difficult to manage. And when I was new at what I was doing, I didn't always have the words or didn't feel like I had a method to translate what I was saying into something that they could understand. But what I've come to learn over the years, of course, some of it came with experience, but what I've come to learn is there are a lot of methods and approaches to communication that you can be trained in and you can practice that are going to help get through this barrier. And so I'm going to talk about two. We're going to talk about the ADEPT method for explaining technical information, and we're also going to talk about the process of listening, paraphrasing, and summarizing. This is really on both sides of the table. I know, I mentioned I had this experience trying to communicate a statistical idea to a person that didn't really feel like they were understanding it. But it also goes the other way around. I'm not a veterinarian. I'm not a nurse. I'm not trained in these areas. And you all have technical information that you need to communicate to me as well. And so both sides of the table need to be using these methods to make sure that we are understanding and communicating what we mean to be communicating. And so, again, love these acronyms. The first one is the ADEPT method for communication. And this has been used in a lot of areas. This is something you can Google, ADEPT method communication, and you'll get lots of resources on it. This stands for analogy, diagram, examples, plain language, and technical definition. And these are all different approaches that you can take that are useful for communicating and understanding concepts. And so analogy, and I'm not going to have a separate slide on each of these, but and again, there's a lot more you can find on this. But analogy is taking the concept you're trying to communicate and drawing an analogy to something that you are maybe more familiar with, or that person would be more familiar with, or something that's more of a universal experience, or relating it to some concepts you've already discussed. So I use this in two ways, and I would say that as a domain expert, you can use both of those too. One is when I'm trying to communicate a statistical concept that could be pretty complicated in the situation I'm trying to apply it to, but there's a much simpler situation where it makes sense and we can work back up to what we're talking about. I will present an analogy during a meeting and say, hey, but this is like this. But other times, if I hear something and I'm like, okay, I'm hearing what you said, I'm not familiar with that, but I have done this before. So, like, maybe I'm not familiar with a certain medical concept or medical thing, but maybe I think it sounds like something I've heard. And I'm like, so when I went to my doctor, we talked about blah, blah, blah. Is this similar to that? So it's not only a way of trying to explain something, but trying to understand whether I have understood something that was being told to me. And from there, you can say, oh, it's not exactly like that, or yeah, it is exactly like that. So that's a really helpful method of communication. Diagrams, I don't think I have to say more. Pictures can be so helpful. I love whenever anyone gives me pictures. It's really saved my life when it comes to anatomy, especially. So please bring all the pictures you can to show me. And of course, I have a pen tablet where I try to draw things during meetings just to see if it makes more sense that way. And then, of course, there's examples. If you are talking about a particular concept, and I think this works really well for subject matter experts to explain things to me. Like, I'm just to give an example with my nursing students, I'll work with things like fall rates a lot. So helping to understand your particular emergency room or your particular environment, if you can give me examples of why patients fall, if you can, and I don't want your patients' names, but if you can tell me about situations when your patients have fallen, why are they falling? What other methods have you tried in the past to help reduce fall rates that haven't worked? The more we can talk about specifics, the better I'll understand the big picture of falls in your environment and what we're trying to do about them. And then, of course, there's plain language. The plainer you can explain something to me without technical terms, of course, the better I'll understand it. And I actually find technical definition to be the least helpful of most of these for most things. But sometimes the technical definition is a requirement, especially when you get to a publication stage, you will need to have the technical definition. So it can still be an important part of communicating a concept. So that's adept, and all of these are great. Like come prepared to use some of these methods to explain what you're trying to get across to the statistician. And also there's listening and paraphrasing and summarizing. Those may be self-explanatory, but some points worth remembering. For listening, honestly, I know this sometimes can be hard for me. I'm always like, I want to jump ahead. I'm like, oh, I get it now. I get it now. And I don't listen to the whole explanation. Or sometimes I know for me, when I'm trying to explain a bigger concept in statistics, it may sound like I'm starting from a place that's not related to the question you asked, but it's something that has to be explained before I can really answer that question. So it is difficult. Listening can be difficult, but it is important to be willing to listen and have the patience to listen. And also remove distractions. Honestly, this is why I'm not a very good phone communicator. And if we want to have a phone meeting, we'll set it up through my email because I don't like to feel like I'm constantly having to check my phone. It is a distraction for me. So remove distractions so you feel like you're more able to listen. Then there's paraphrasing. This is something I use all the time. When someone explains a concept to me, I will literally just restate to them in my own words what they told me. And when you do this, you want to explain why you're doing it because it can be kind of weird to have someone just repeat everything to you. But I'll say, I want to make sure I understood. So here's what I heard. And I will rephrase it again, in my own words, just to make sure I understood it. And this is kind of a precursor to teach back, if you're familiar with this method. The best way to make sure you understood something is to teach it. And probably a lot of you, I know many of you are going to be academic in one way or another. If you've ever had the experience of teaching something, that's when you feel like you really learn it. And so the idea here is to kind of do that in miniature. And if you explain something to me about how you do a procedure or, how something was done in an experiment, I might say it back to you and say, okay, so you're getting ready to do this. So you do this, 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 and this. And that's the easiest way for me to confirm that I heard what they said. And they'll say, yep, that's right, or no, that's not right, but here's where you were not correct. And it's a great way to just make sure that you've really understood what the other person is saying. And the final part is summarizing, and that's a little bigger than paraphrasing. Just kind of bringing everything together before you move forward to the next part of your meeting. And all of these things, again, I know this feels like a kind of touchy-feely webinar, but all of these things have been really important to all of my successful interactions with people, is just making sure that I follow these steps and it really helps me to understand the problem, and it can really help the person I'm working with to understand the statistical approach I'm taking based on everything they've told me. And finally, the last part is relationship. Again, I know we're kind of getting into the touchy-feely stuff here, but when I say relationship, I'm talking about the relationship between the domain expert and the statistical collaborator, and that might be for the course of one project or for multiple projects. But relationship is kind of what really makes everything fall into place, kind of puts all the gears together and makes them turn. What is relationship built on? Relationship is built on authentic interest. If I'm not authentically interested in your project, I'm at a point now where I will probably refer you to somebody else that I know will be interested in it. So having authentic interest in what we're both doing is really important. Learning and trading professional language as we continue to work together, the more I'll understand what you do. You won't have to explain all of your terminology every time we talk, and vice versa. You'll know a little bit more about how I'm going to think about your project and what I'm looking for when it comes to the data, and when it comes to the kinds of solutions I'm going to offer. It's built on respect for expertise and skills. And I hate to say it, but I think in reality, in real life, this is where a lot of relationships, a lot of collaborations go wrong. It is very difficult to work with someone or to follow the advice or, you know, believe in the work that someone's doing if they don't have respect for you and if you don't respect them. And all these relationships, of course, it requires time and patience and trust. And the way to make that happen is to offer these things, behave in a trustworthy way when you're in a collaboration, have patience. Again, in the beginning, especially if a person doesn't work in your area, usually, if if they've had less experience, that patience it is required, but ultimately it can result in a very good relationship. And the same thing with the time part of it. And I'll say just some notes I have on the side here. My relationships with my clients have, I think, having a good relationship, it obviously just makes your life more pleasant and it can contribute to satisfaction in your career. But in the big picture, the better relationships we have in general between subject matter experts and statisticians, I think that leads to more longevity in careers and more satisfaction with careers in general. And it's going to come up with ultimately better answers to the research that we're all doing. It allows for more productivity in a shorter time, and it creates, better in the end, your ultimate research or business or policy products are going to be better because of that relationship. Relationship helps avoid issues like some of the most common issues that I think people on both sides have. I know one thing that statisticians say all the time is you didn't come to me early enough. Well, the better relationship you build, the more likely I find that people are going to come to me when they're just coming up with an idea of something. So having that relationship in place can help solve that problem. And same thing when you're like, well, I brought my project to a statistician and I don't feel like they really answered the actual question I had. Well, the better the relationship, the more you'll understand each other and the more likely you'll be able to answer the actual questions that you have about your data. And you do have to evaluate. There are some relationships that aren't good and aren't worth continuing. So it is good to evaluate the state of your relationship with the person you're working with as well. So yeah, that's the Asker framework. And again, I know this was not a particularly technical webinar, but I think this underlies kind of the way that I think about working with domain experts. And when you can bring all of this with you, it's going to improve the chances that you're going to end up with a research product or an answer to your question that is going to be what you were looking for. So even when again, if we go all the way back to the beginning and think about the fact that, yeah, I can't really tell you what meeting with a specific statistical collaborator is going to be like. If you come armed with these tools, then the chances are much better that you will have a good relationship and a good outcome from that meeting. So here are my final thoughts on this. Collaboration on both sides, and the data person and the subject matter person, it's going to result in better outcomes. This is not just, this is not just for the sake of your health. This is really being able to accomplish all of these pieces, and thinking about this framework is going to result in better answers to your question, because you'll know that everyone is understanding it, and you have open communication about it. And I think ideally, both, but either person involved can bring this collaborative attitude to the table and sort of lead by example. Communication truly runs in both directions. And I want statisticians to adopt this. Like, this is when I'm doing, when I'm really thinking about my contributions to the profession, this is what I emphasize. I really want all statistical collaborators to have this kind of framework or this kind of thinking, but domain experts, the person coming to see them, can bring this as well, and it will greatly improve the communication. And again, the different, I guess, just to tie it together, the different parts of this framework do work together. Obviously, you have to have the collaborative attitude in order to really want to implement the rest of this. Having the structure for the meeting, yeah, the structure's good, but if you have the communication aspect of it that we talked about, and you're always keeping that balance of qualitative and quantitative content in mind, that works together really well with that meeting structure. And again, the relationship kind of puts all the pieces in place to make sure that this runs as smoothly as possible. So the different parts of this all do work together. Just to go back to the very beginning, the rest of my webinars, they are going to be more statistically oriented. They are going to be a little bit more technical, but this is the perspective that I have in the background the whole time. When I put this together and I'm like, how do I help clients work with statisticians? I think common advice that, maybe is a little bit more old school, or that like has been kind of said in the past, is make sure you come early enough. Make sure you come early enough in your project, and, get some statistical background before you try to work with statistical analysis. Take a statistics course. I mean, those are all great things for someone to do, but you could very easily kind of turn those things around and say, well, I didn't come earlier because statisticians aren't really available enough. Or, I wasn't able to talk to you until, this month or whatever, and I had to get started on the project. Or you don't have enough subject matter background. If you had enough subject matter background, then I wouldn't need to have all the statistical knowledge. So there's always two perspectives on everything. When you have this kind of framework in place, there's really no reason to kind of place blame on either person. You just can move forward with the understanding of what both of you are coming with and what you can communicate about and improve. So the rest of these webinars, though, the whole goal of the rest of them is going to be to provide you maybe with some more background, just to help you feel more comfortable before you visit a statistician or before you work with a statistician, to maybe give you a little bit more statistical thinking, a little bit more comfort with the language of a statistician and the way that a statistician may communicate. So with all of this in the background, that's going to be the goal of those future webinars, is just, all right, so you're thinking along these lines. What can you prepare? How can you put together a research question? How is that statistician going to be thinking about the data? Things that, again, will be nice for the statistician, but hopefully the goal is really to give you more confidence in contacting that person. And I'm going to put up my email address, and I hope this was helpful, really, again, just for some perspective. I will be posting this and making this available. And again, there's the link to the actual paper with this framework in the webinar. Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone.